It was a typical Friday night when it happened. Emma had just come back home after a long, exhausting week of work. She was tired, too tired to cook, too tired to even think about making herself a proper meal. She had a craving for something greasy, something comforting. So, like any person who couldn't be bothered to lift a finger, she pulled out her phone and opened the food delivery app. Scrolling through the familiar list of restaurants, she finally decided on a place she had ordered from before, a small, local burger joint she loved. They had the best fries, and the burger options were always hot and juicy. Perfect. She ordered her usual, a cheeseburger with extra pickles, fries, and a milkshake. Simple, nothing fancy. Once the order was placed, Emma sat back on her couch, her phone in hand, waiting for the confirmation that the food was on its way. The app showed that the order had been accepted, and the expected delivery time was about 30 minutes. She let out a sigh of relief, already imagining the satisfying crunch of the fries and the first bite of the burger. As she leaned back into the couch, the comfort of the night starting to settle in, her phone buzzed. "Delivery in progress," flashed on the screen. Emma smiled to herself. It was only 15 minutes past, and the food was on its way. Maybe it wouldn't take as long as she thought. She decided to pour herself a glass of wine while she waited. Her fingers drummed lightly on the wine glass, a small distraction as she began to let herself relax. The day's stresses seemed to melt away, and soon, she was lost in the comforting hum of the TV show playing in the background. But then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the delivery driver. "I'm outside your building. Where should I drop it off?" Emma frowned slightly. Her apartment complex was in the middle of a busy street, and there were several entrances. Sometimes the delivery drivers got confused. She quickly texted back, giving clear instructions on which entrance the driver should use. A few minutes passed, and she figured she should get up and head to the door. The food wasn't going to bring itself inside, after all. As she stepped into the hallway of her apartment, she noticed something odd. The air felt cold, unnaturally cold for a summer evening. She shrugged it off, assuming the air conditioning was on too high, but the sensation lingered. Walking toward the entrance of her building, she looked out the small window by the door. There was a dark car parked outside, its headlights turned off, sitting idly in the parking lot. No one was in it. "Strange," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "Maybe it's just someone waiting for someone else." She waited by the door, her phone still in her hand, keeping an eye on the time. It had been almost 10 minutes since the driver had messaged her. Was he lost? Just as she was about to text again, the buzzer for the building entrance rang. Bzzzzzt. Emma pressed the button and said, "Yes." A voice on the other end of the intercom crackled to life. "Hi, Emma. It's your delivery driver. I'm here with your order." Emma smiled, feeling a wave of relief. "Great, come on up. I'm in apartment 4B. There was a brief pause before the voice responded. "All right, I'll be there in a minute." The elevator dinged in the distance, and Emma went back to the couch, waiting for the driver to appear at her door. She was eager to get her food, to finally sit down and relax with something to eat. She didn't think anything of it as she heard the elevator arrive at her floor. The doorbell rang a moment later. Emma jumped slightly, surprised by the speed. She walked over to the door, her stomach growling in anticipation. She opened it, ready to grab her meal. But when she looked at the man standing in the hallway, something felt off. He wasn't what she expected. He wasn't the usual driver she had gotten before, young, friendly, maybe a little awkward. No, this man was older, probably in his mid-40s. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, and his eyes, they were wide, too wide. There was something strange about them, like he was too eager. Or maybe frightened. He was holding the brown paper bag with her order, but he didn't offer it right away. Instead, he just stood there, staring at her for a moment too long. Emma blinked, taken aback. She forced a smile and extended her hand. Hi. You must be my delivery driver. Thanks. The man handed her the bag, his hand brushing against hers for a moment longer than necessary. His fingers were cold, and it sent an odd chill down Emma's spine. Enjoy your meal, he said in a low voice, but his tone sounded almost rehearsed, like he had said the same thing 100 times before. Emma nodded quickly, taking the bag from him. Thanks, she said again, her voice more hurried now. I'll take it from here. But before she could close the door, the driver spoke again. Are you sure you're okay? You seem nervous. Emma blinked, confused. What do you mean? The man took a step closer, his eyes still unnervingly wide. I think you should be careful tonight. There's something in the air. His voice dropped to a whisper, and his words sent a strange shiver down Emma's spine. Before she could react, he took a step back. You'll be fine, he added, almost cheerfully, before turning and walking quickly down the hall. Emma stared after him for a moment, the bag still clutched tightly in her hand. The door was half open as she stood there, staring at the hallway where the driver had disappeared. Something about the encounter left her unsettled. But she tried to shake it off. She closed the door and locked it, trying to convince herself it was just an odd encounter with a stranger. The world wasn't always as friendly as it seemed, and people sometimes acted weird, especially in the late hours. Turning back into her apartment, she walked toward the kitchen counter and placed the bag down. She opened it, pulling out her burger, her fries, and the milkshake. She was hungry. She needed to eat. But as she sat down, ready to take her first bite, something caught her eye. The fries were wrong. They were cold. Lukewarm, at best. Not freshly fried, not crispy. The burger, too, was off. It looked fine, but when she picked it up, she noticed something disturbing. There was a dark stain on the bottom of the bun, like some kind of oil that had seeped through. Emma put the burger back down, her appetite suddenly gone. She stared at it, wondering if it had been sitting out too long. But it didn't make sense. It hadn't been more than 30 minutes since she placed the order. She reached for the milkshake, but when she unscrewed the lid, a strange smell hit her. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rotten, sour odor, like something had gone bad. Confused and starting to feel uneasy, Emma pushed the food away from her. Her stomach churned, but not from hunger. There was something else at play here, something that wasn't right. Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up, hoping it was just a harmless notification. But when she glanced at the screen, her blood ran cold. It was a message from the same delivery driver. I hope you like your meal. Enjoy your night, Emma. But the message was sent after he had left. Her heart began to race as the weight of the situation settled in. What had just happened? Emma stared at her phone screen, the message still sitting there, blinking at her in the darkened room. Her hands began to tremble, and she set the phone down slowly, her stomach twisting uncomfortably. The words on the screen echoed in her mind. I hope you like your meal. Enjoy your night, Emma. But how could he know her name? She hadn't told him. She hadn't given him any information beyond her address. The app didn't ask for her full name when she placed the order. In fact, it had been a pretty standard transaction. Just a name and delivery address, nothing more. Panic began to creep up her spine as she thought about the strange look in the delivery driver's eyes. The way he had stared at her for just a little too long. The way he had stood so close to her, his cold fingers brushing against hers, sending an inexplicable chill through her body. And now this message. Something wasn't right. Emma quickly picked up the phone again, unlocking it and pulling up the delivery app. She went to check the driver's details. But when she pulled up the order history, her stomach dropped. There was nothing. No history of the order at all. She double-checked the app, refreshed it, and even tried logging out and logging back in. But no matter what she did, the order history remained empty. There was no trace of the transaction. She couldn't even see the name of the driver. She opened the messages again, but the app didn't show any previous chats or communication with the driver, just that one single message. Her breath became shallow as her mind raced. It didn't make sense. The food had been real, and she had paid for it, right? There was no way she had imagined any of it. But if the app wasn't showing her the order, how had the driver known her name? She got up and paced across the room, her mind running in circles. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was just a glitch. She tried to rationalize it, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tried to distract herself by turning on the TV, but her mind couldn't focus on anything other than the unsettling feeling in her chest. That's when she heard it. A faint sound. A knocking. It was coming from the door. Her heart leapt into her throat. The knocking was slow, deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone was standing on the other side, waiting. The sound seemed to echo throughout the apartment, growing louder with each knock. Emma stood frozen, her eyes wide in terror. She hadn't ordered anything else. She hadn't received any other deliveries. Her phone was still sitting on the counter, and there were no new notifications or messages. Another knock. This time, it was more insistent. Knock. 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 Her first instinct was to hide. She didn't know what was going on, but something in her gut told her not to open the door. She was alone, and she didn't know who, or what, was on the other side. But then, another message came through on her phone. She grabbed it quickly, trying to distract herself, trying to convince herself that maybe it was just a mistake, that the delivery driver had returned for something. She opened the message. I left something for you outside. Take it, Emma. You need to see what's next. Her blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she read the words again, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She couldn't explain it, but her body instinctively moved toward the door. She couldn't just sit here. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. The knocking came again, louder this time. It sounded different, more frantic, as though the person on the other side was growing impatient. The sound reverberated through her apartment like a drumbeat, each knock pounding in her chest. She forced herself to walk toward the door, her legs heavy as if they were dragging through thick mud. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob for a long moment. Should I open it? She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Something was pulling her toward the door, making her believe that if she didn't open it, whatever was happening would only get worse. With shaking fingers, she turned the handle and opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the hallway. There was no one standing there. Instead, on the floor just outside her door, there was a small package, wrapped in brown paper, with a single black ribbon tied around it. The ribbon looked strange, out of place, and it was tightly knotted, as if someone had carefully, deliberately prepared it. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the package for a long moment, the unease crawling through her veins like a cold, slithering creature. Was it another trick? Was this part of some sick joke? She almost reached out to grab it, but the knocking started again. Louder. Faster. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively slammed the door shut, pressing her back against it. The knocking stopped immediately. What is going on? Her mind spun, and she felt paralyzed, unable to move. The message. The package. The driver. Nothing made sense. She had to do something. She had to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. She glanced back at the package one more time. The knot on the ribbon was now subtly different, almost as if it had shifted since she had first seen it. Without thinking, she grabbed the package, yanked it inside, and slammed the door behind her. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she set the package down on the kitchen counter. It was heavier than she expected. For a moment, Emma just stared at it. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, and despite the bizarre situation, she had an undeniable urge to open it. Something in her gut told her that once she did, things would change. Slowly, she untied the black ribbon, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. The paper came off easily, revealing a small wooden box. It was plain, unassuming, but when she touched it, she felt a strange warmth radiating from it. Her fingers brushed over the edges, feeling a strange, unexplainable pull, as though the box was calling to her. She opened it. Inside, there was a single item, a folded piece of paper, carefully placed inside the box, along with something small and round that looked like a button. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and it looked like it had been written by hand. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. "Take the next step, Emma. You're not alone." Emma's hands shook as she held the note in front of her, her eyes scanning the cryptic message over and over again. "Take the next step, Emma. You're not alone." The words felt like they were burning into her mind, an echo she couldn't escape. What did it mean? Who was leaving her these things? Why her? The small, round object in the box caught her eye. It was simple, a button, silver and smooth, with a strange, almost ancient symbol etched into it. The symbol looked like an eye with long, intricate lines surrounding it, like something out of an occult book. Without thinking, she reached for it, turning it over in her hand. The moment her fingers touched it, the air around her seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in temperature, a heavy stillness that seemed to hang in the room. Emma pulled her hand away, heart hammering in her chest. Something wasn't right. Her phone buzzed again, and she jumped, startled. She didn't want to check it. She didn't want to acknowledge it. But she couldn't resist. The message was from an unknown number. It wasn't the delivery driver this time. "It's time, Emma. You've been chosen. You can't go back now." Her blood ran cold. She dropped the note and the button on the counter, backing away slowly, her head spinning. She didn't know what was happening, but the unease she felt earlier had now transformed into a sharp, gut-wrenching panic. Something was coming for her. She could feel it, right down to her very bones. Her apartment felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on her. She backed into the kitchen, then turned, and immediately grabbed her purse. The need to get out, to escape whatever this was, overwhelmed her. She needed air. She needed to think, to process what was going on. As she hurried toward the door, the phone buzzed again. Emma hesitated, her fingers trembling as she grabbed it. Another message. "You're not safe. There's nowhere to hide." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Her breath became shallow as she dropped the phone on the counter, a sick feeling settling in her stomach. The knocking at the door started again. Faster. Stronger. It rattled the frame, each strike growing more frantic than the last. Her heart skipped a beat as the sound of something heavy, something large, scraping across the floor outside her apartment made her freeze in place. Was someone trying to break in? A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention. She turned toward the window, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the darkness outside, she saw a shadow move quickly past the window. No. No, no, no. She rushed to the door, locking it behind her, bolting the deadbolt. The knocking continued, louder than ever. The feeling of being watched pressed against her like a physical force. Emma stood in the middle of her apartment, frozen, her mind racing. She tried to think of a plan, but nothing came to her. What was she supposed to do? Who was doing this to her? She glanced back at the small wooden box on the counter, the note still lying beside it. Her mind flashed back to the message, "Take the next step." What did that mean? What did they want from her? Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She hesitated but picked it up. The message was brief. "You have 5 minutes." She didn't understand. What did she have 5 minutes to do? It didn't make sense. The knock at the door turned into a pounding, the sound echoing through the building like a drumbeat, rattling her bones. Then, she saw it. A shadow flickered just outside the crack beneath the door. It was too fast to be human. It darted past, disappearing into the hallway. The pounding stopped. And then, something else started. A whisper. A soft, almost inaudible sound. "Come out, Emma." Her blood ran cold. The voice was low and gravelly, almost as if it came from the walls themselves. A bone-chilling wave of fear crashed over her, and she felt her heart thumping in her chest. She was too scared to move. Too scared to even breathe. Then came another knock. Softer this time. As if whoever, or whatever, was outside knew she was listening. The door handle rattled, jiggling violently as if someone were trying to force their way in. Emma's hand went to her pocket instinctively, pulling out her phone. She didn't know what else to do. She quickly dialed the emergency services number, her fingers trembling as the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? Emma's voice came out shaky and panicked. Someone's outside my apartment, and they're knocking, trying to get in. I don't know who they are. Please, help. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then the dispatcher spoke in a calm, but firm voice. Stay on the line. Help is on the way. Are you safe? Why yes, I'm inside my apartment, but they're outside the door. They're trying to get in, Emma stammered. I don't know who they are, but they've been sending me messages, Anne. Before she could finish, the line cut out. A loud crackling sound came from the phone, followed by silence. Emma pulled it away from her ear, blinking at the screen in confusion. The call had ended. No. No, no, no. Her phone buzzed again. A message, but not from the police. It was from the same unknown number. You're not supposed to have called. There's nowhere to hide, Emma. Emma's heart dropped into her stomach as the realization hit her. They knew. They knew she had called the police. And now, she had no idea what was going to happen next. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her, suffocating her. The knocking came again, louder now, almost frantic. She could hear it behind the door. There was someone on the other side, no longer bothering to pretend to be polite. They wanted in. You're running out of time. The message blinked on the screen before her eyes, and suddenly the door rattled once more, this time with a force that shook the walls. Something slammed against the door. The force was so great that Emma was thrown back onto the floor, the phone slipping from her hands. Panic overwhelmed her. She scrambled back up, her breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. She had no time left. No time to think. No time to hide. The door exploded open. The door crashed open with a deafening bang. Emma's heart leapt in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, eyes wide with terror. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if they were alive, suffocating her with the thick air that seemed to hum with some unspoken presence. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move, pushing herself away from the now broken door. It swung inward, the splintered wood creaking on its hinges. But no one was standing there. Emma's breath caught. The hallway outside her apartment was empty, just the cold, dimly lit corridor stretching out before her. There was no one in sight. But she felt them. She felt their presence. A chill ran down her spine, and her skin prickled with an unnatural cold. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting around the apartment. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was suffocating. Every little sound she made echoed in the empty room, her breathing, the shuffle of her feet, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Was this a trick? Was someone playing with her? Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond her sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. She glanced back toward the broken door, but no one was there. The faintest of whispers echoed from the hallway, too soft to catch with her ears, but too strong to ignore. She could feel it pressing against her skin, creeping into her mind. "Come out, Emma. It's your turn now." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was calm, almost seductive, but beneath it was something darker, something cold. It was the same voice she'd heard earlier, the one that had been knocking at her door, the one that had sent the messages. Her stomach churned, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She had to move. She had to leave. The phone. She had to get her phone back. With one last glance toward the broken door, Emma rushed to the kitchen counter, grabbing her phone. But it wasn't there. She froze. It was gone. Her phone vanished. She could have sworn it was just there. Her eyes darted around the counter, her heart pounding louder. The entire apartment suddenly felt like it was closing in on her. Where was it? What was happening? A cold gust of wind blew through the apartment, the door swinging on its hinges, the broken pieces of wood scraping against the floor. The chill cut through Emma like a knife, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "You don't need that phone, Emma. You won't need anything anymore." Emma whipped her head toward the doorway. The hallway was still empty, but she could feel it now, something was watching her. She wasn't alone. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it, a dark shape standing just outside the broken door. It was tall, humanoid, but there was something wrong with it. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct but wrong, too long, too unnatural. It moved, but its motions were jerky, like it was dragging itself across the floor, each step more unnerving than the last. The eyes. The eyes were the worst part. They were wide, unblinking, hollow, black pits that seemed to reflect nothing. But Emma could feel them, she could feel them crawling over her skin, burrowing into her mind. She could feel the thing watching her, waiting. She stumbled back, her legs shaking, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't take her eyes off the figure. It was slowly advancing toward her, one jerky step at a time. "You shouldn't have come. Now you'll never leave," the figure said, its voice low and guttural, like a growl wrapped in whispers. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Emma backed away toward the window, but the figure moved faster. It was right in front of her now, standing between her and the door. There was no way out. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything to defend herself with. She couldn't fight it. There was no fighting it. And then, it spoke again. "You've already seen too much." With that, it raised its hand toward her. Its fingers were long, skeletal, like twisted claws reaching for her, and they moved unnaturally, as if they were bending in ways that fingers should never bend. Emma screamed. She screamed with every ounce of fear in her body, and in that instant, the thing lunged toward her. The world around her exploded in pain. The last thing she remembered was the cold fingers wrapping around her throat. Emma opened her eyes with a jolt. The world was dark, but she wasn't sure where she was. It was cold, too cold, and the silence was suffocating. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as though she were weighed down by something far beyond her strength. She was lying on the floor. Her head throbbed with pain, and she could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. She groaned, trying to sit up, but her vision was blurry. It took her a few moments to gather her bearings. When she finally stood, she gasped in horror. She was no longer in her apartment. She was in a room, no, not a room. It was a place, vast and dark, with no walls, no ceiling. Just endless space stretching out in all directions. The air was thick, as if she was standing in a void. She felt disconnected from her own body, as though the very ground she stood on was slowly eroding beneath her. And then, she heard it. A low, deep hum, vibrating through the space. The sound came from all around her, from deep within the dark void. It was as though the very air was alive, the hum shaking the ground beneath her feet. Emma turned in place, frantic, but there was nothing to see. The darkness had swallowed everything. Her heart raced as a wave of realization crashed over her. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. She wasn't even in the world she knew. She was somewhere else. Somewhere far darker. And then, in the distance, she saw them. Figures, shadows, shapes moving toward her. They were indistinct, blurred by the darkness, but their presence was undeniable. "It's time, Emma," a voice whispered, but it was 1,000 voices at once, echoing in the void. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. There was no escaping. The figures came closer, their movements slow but purposeful. Their eyes, hollow, black, unblinking, stared at her. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. As the figures closed in, Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She tried to move, to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness around her seemed to press in tighter, suffocating her. She could feel their cold, empty eyes on her, their presence invading her mind. One of the figures reached out with long, skeletal fingers, its hand hovering just inches from her face. It spoke, its voice a guttural whisper that echoed in her skull. "You've crossed the threshold, Emma. There's no turning back." The air grew colder, and she felt her body freezing, her limbs growing heavier. The world around her started to distort, twisting and warping. Her vision blurred, and in that moment, she realized that she wasn't just in another place, she was in another reality. Before she could react, the figure's hand touched her skin. The instant contact sent a jolt of icy electricity through her, and everything went black. She woke up with a start, gasping for air, but the world around her was different. There were no shadows, no figures. Just silence. And then, in the distance, she heard a soft, familiar whisper. "Welcome to your new world, Emma." It was then that she understood. She had been chosen. And there was no escape.